Hello, friends. For our second series, I'm inviting you to read a short story with me every week. This is Anthologized. I'm Amanda Corbin from Milestone Art Collective, and I'll be here every week to tell you about a short story that's been widely anthologized. We talk about how the author did what they did from a craft standpoint, and to share a writing prompt based on the story. Before I begin, I want to say thank you to our patrons who support our work at Milestone Art Collective, and we are very grateful for you. If you are interested in becoming a patron, you can find us at patreon.com/Milestone Art Collective. This week, I'm talking about Susan Sontag's short story, The Way We Live Now. As I said in the intro to this series, I'm reading widely anthologized short stories to fill in some gaps in my own reading. And Susan Sontag is one of the authors on the list that I'd heard of but never read. And to tell you about her story, I have to tell you about her. The 2019 biography, titled Sontag, won the Pulitzer in its category, and this is what the publisher said about it. The definitive portrait of one of the American century's most towering intellectuals. Her writing and her radical thought, her public activism, and her hidden private face. No writer is as emblematic of the American 20th century as Susan Sontag. Mythologized and misunderstood, lauded and loathed. A girl from the suburbs who became a proud symbol of cosmopolitanism. Sontag left a legacy of writing on art and politics, feminism and homosexuality, celebrity and style, medicine and drugs, radicalism and fascism and Freudianism and communism and Americanism that forms an indispensable key to modern culture. No writer negotiated as many worlds. No serious writer had as many glamorous lovers. The biography tells these stories and examines the work upon which her reputation is based. It explores the agonizing insecurity behind the formidable public face, broken relationships, the struggles with her sexuality that animated and undermined her writing. And it shows her attempts to respond to the cruelties and absurdities of a country that had lost its way, and her conviction that fidelity to high culture was an activism of its own. End quote. It's a long one, but as this synopsis of her biography shows, she was probably best known as an author of nonfiction essays in culture, of which she published 9 books. But she also published 4 novels, among them the 2000 National Book Award winner titled In America. She also wrote several plays, and she wrote and directed films. She died in 2004. Her short story that we're looking at this week, The Way We Live Now, was originally published in The New Yorker in 1986. It was included in her collected short fiction in the 2018 book, Debriefing. Now, because Susan Sontag was a critic, and she wrote a National Book Award-nominated essay collection called Against Interpretation, I wondered, what is the best way to talk about her work? In that essay, in the essay Against Interpretation, she writes about how artists and critics began to separate form from content, and she rejects, quote, the habit of approaching works of art in order to interpret them. And as a side note, literary criticism isn't the practice of criticizing, as in looking for faults. Though judgment might be involved, it's more to think critically. That's where the critical part is. So to think critically about a piece of art, to analyze, evaluate, contextualize, and interpret. But Sontag writes, by reducing the work of art to its content and interpreting that, one tames the work of art. Interpretation makes art manageable, comfortable. So, rather than talk about the content of the way we live now and what it might mean, I'll try to just talk about what it is. This is your spoiler alert. If you haven't read The Way We Live Now, you can stop here, find it in the New Yorker online, or in the aforementioned collection of short stories, or any number of fiction anthologies, and there are links below if you would rather do that. So, at the risk of separating form from content, I thought I might describe the structure and style of the story. And then I thought I really have to start with perspective. But then I thought, first I really have to note that Susan Sontag likely sought to elude interpretation, if her essay is any indication. So with this story, she, as she says in her essay, she may be making a work of art whose surface is so unified and clean, whose momentum is so rapid, whose address is so direct that the work can be just what it is. And I love the thought of art that is so what it is that it resists interpretation, that no one can fully explain it. So I could say, just read it, because it so completely marries form with content that the two can't be separated and the story just is. And so I could say, just read it. It resists interpretation. And that would be true. You could say that. If you just listen to me talk about it without reading it yourself, you won't have the complete picture of this story. But in addition to encouraging you to read a short story every week, I'm here to talk about the stories. So I'm going to do that. The Way We Live Now is a story about the AIDS epidemic. And as the title tells us, it's about how that crisis changed the way we live. For those of us who are writers and want to know how to write about subjects like this that affect the collective, this story is an example. To address the collective, you focus on the individual. So while this is a story of how the AIDS crisis affected the collective, it's told through the story of one man who has contracted the virus. And that brings me to perspective. The Way We Live Now is written from a third-person point of view, but it's not an omniscient, all-seeing narrator. The scope of the story is limited to the perspective of the friends of the unnamed AIDS patient. We only ever see him through their eyes and hear him speak through their recountings of what he has said. As readers, it feels kind of like we're eavesdropping on their conversations about him. And toward the beginning of the story, we have this passage. It seemed that everyone was in touch with everyone else several times a week, checking in. I've never spent so many hours at a time on the phone, Stephen said to Kate. And when I'm exhausted after 2 or 3 calls made to me, giving me the latest, instead of switching off the phone to give myself a respite, I tap out the number of another friend or acquaintance to pass on the news. The run-on sentences here give the impression of real speech, and the phrase Stephen said to Kate feels like we're receiving secondhand information, and then also that almost gossipy behavior of passing on the news to other friends brings to mind a game of telephone where the information is passed from one person to another and the original message changes along the way. And then that makes the narration feel a bit unreliable as far as the details around the unnamed character at the center of the story, but the overall mood of the story is not unreliable so much as it is varied among all the friends, because everyone reacts a little bit differently, from worry and sadness to hope, and from dread and grief to anxiety over potentially losing their friend, or others to the disease. The perspective is also linked to the style of the story, and when I say style, I mean the way it's told. The story itself is constructed of 15 sections, where each section is one long paragraph without quotation marks around any speech. There might be attributions like he told her, or he admitted, or simply the word said, but it all flows in a rush, so it's hard to tell exactly who is saying what to whom, because it all runs together. And like in a real conversation, there are also moments where one comment gives way to another that's not directly related to the AIDS patient's story. But it still tells us about the people and the time and the place that the story exists within. Better than describing the style is to show it. So here's an excerpt where the title of the story appears. "Well, everybody is worried about everybody now," said Betsy. "That seems to be the way we live now. And, after all, they were once very close. Doesn't Louis still have keys to his apartment? You know, the way you let someone keep the keys after you've broken up, only a little, because you hope the person might just saunter in, drunk or high, late some evening, but mainly because it's wise to have a few sets of keys strewn around town if you live alone, at the top of a former commercial building that, pretentious as it is, will never acquire a doorman or even a resident superintendent. Someone whom you can call on for the keys late one night if you find you've lost yours or have locked yourself out." The second sentence here is over 100 words long, and this breathless wordiness contributes to the pace of the piece, because you're not getting a chance to pause at the end of a sentence for 6 or 7 lines. You're just taking it as it comes. And I thought this style would be hard to sustain over the full story. I thought that I would get weary of it after a while, but because there's new plot information that's at the beginning of each section, it kept me turning the pages. The story keeps unfolding in each section. So, as an example, here are the beginnings of the first 4 sections. At first, he was just losing weight. And when he was in the hospital, and the third one is, he didn't want to be alone. And the fourth one is, and when some of the friends, the ones who came every day, waylaid the doctor in the corridor. So each one of these openings gives us more information about how things are proceeding with the AIDS patient. And then there are later sections that open with mentions of treatment, going home from the hospital and then back, and so on. And there are these ups and downs as the story progresses. And then it ultimately ends on an ambiguous, but I think perfect note. If you've ever had a loved one in and out of the hospital or been with someone through a serious illness, that uncertainty and up and down pace is familiar. And speaking of the ending, it was the ending that stayed with me after I read this story. In the last 2 sections, there's talk of death and the story of Saint Sebastian. But then there's also talk of recovery and being discharged from the hospital. And then the story ends with these, compared to the rest of the story, relatively short sentences. I was thinking, Ursula said to Quentin, that the difference between a story and a painting or a photograph is that in a story you can write, "He's still alive." But in a painting or a photo, you can't show still. You can just show him being alive. He's still alive, Stephen said. He's still alive, Stephen said, is the last sentence of the story. And through that, the character, he's still alive at the end of the story. And there's this almost metafictional sense that by writing it this way, he always will be. And I just thought that was a perfect ending. Yeah. So Susan Sontag wrote in her essay that commentary could reveal the sensuous surface of art without mucking about in it. So I hope that's what I've done here, and I hope it helped your understanding of the story and your appreciation of the story without interpreting it too much. With writing prompts, I always tell my students to go with what inspires you rather than strictly adhering to anything I suggest in a prompt. So maybe you read this story and were inspired to write about illness, or maybe you want to write about something that it has an effect on the collective. Maybe you liked the style and want to do something interesting with style. So if so, go with any one of those or whatever inspired you about this story. Or as a simple prompt, you can ask yourself, with your writing, what moment in time do you want to capture? And can you merge form and content somehow? To quote against interpretation one last time, interpretation takes the sensory experience of the work of art for granted and proceeds from there. This cannot be taken for granted now. Think of the sheer multiplication of works of art available to every one of us. Ours is a culture based on excess, on overproduction. The result is a steady loss of sharpness in our sensory experience. The aim of all commentary on art should be to make works of art and, by analogy, our own experience more rather than less real to us. That's probably even more true now. There's so much available to us, and there's so much excess and so much speed at which we're traveling. So how can we sharpen our sensory experience of the story we want to write? How can you make it and your experience more real? Maybe you start with form and don't try to tame it or make it manageable or comfortable, but just see where it leads. Let it be what it is. I hope this story and prompt inspire you to make your own work of art. Next time, I will be reading and talking about Robert Stone's short story, Helping, and I invite you to read along with me and join me here next week. If it's more convenient, you can use the link provided to get a copy of the anthology 100 Years of the Best American Short Stories, or you can find it online. And just to give you a little sneak peek, I'm going to read a little of the beginning. Helping by Robert Stone. One gray November day, Elliot went to Boston for the afternoon. The wet streets seemed cold and lonely. He sensed a broken promise in the city's elegance and verve. Old hopes tormented him like phantom limbs, but he did not drink. He had joined Alcoholics Anonymous 15 months before. Christmas came, childless, a festival of regret. His wife went to Mass and cooked a turkey. Sober, Elliot walked in the woods. In January, blizzards swept down from the Arctic until the weather became too cold for snow. The Shawmut Valley grew quiet and crystalline. In the white silences, Elliot could hear the boards of his house contract and feel a shrinking in his bones. Each dusk, starveling deer came out of the wooded swamp behind the house to graze his orchard for whatever raccoons had uncovered and left behind. At night, he lay beside his sleeping wife, listening to the baying of dog packs running them down in the deep, moon-shadowed snow. Day in, day out, he was sober. At times it was almost stimulating, but he could not shake off the sensations he had felt in Boston. In his mind's eye, he could see dead leaves rattling along the brick gutters and savor that day's desperation. The brief outing had undermined him. Sober, however, he remained, until the day a man named Blankenship came into his office at the state hospital for counseling. Blankenship had red hair, a brutal face, and a sneaking manner. He was a sponger and a petty thief whom Elliot had seen a number of times before. "I've been having this dream," Blankenship announced loudly. His voice was not pleasant. His skin was unwholesome. Every time he got arrested, the court sent him to the psychiatrists, and the psychiatrists, who spoke little English, sent him to Elliot. And that's a little of the beginning of Robert Stone's short story, Helping. I hope you'll join me next time for some fiction craft talk about this story and try a writing prompt. Until then, happy reading.